This is part 2 and lecture 4, beginning with the Abbasids from 750 to 1258. And this, in this lecture, we look at Islam all over the place. And admittedly and fairly, Muslims have much to be proud of as they look back on their history. At least they've had a lot of success. We begin by thinking of Islam in the East. Remember, we looked at Islam in the West, and now this is Islam in the East. This is the Abbasid, which is really the glorious age of Islam. And we're still in the context. We're talking about the context of Islam. Hope you're not getting bored with all this history. But it is, I think, really significant to realize the things that have happened in Islam that are pretty great. In other words, the glorious things that have happened. These are major and minor dynasties, power centers, if you will. And the Abbasids are something that Muslims have a lot to be proud of. It's from 750 to 1258. It was the second major dynasty in the Islamic Empire. The capital was Baghdad, or Baghdad. I think it's about there. It doesn't show up very well on that map. But no longer in Damascus. The capital is in Baghdad. And you can see why somebody like, Saddam Hussein would have looked back on the history with such pride. They wouldn't want to be conquered by any outside power. This was the great history behind, centered in Baghdad in the past. Civilization here in Islam is climaxed in the sense that medicine and science and art and literature was really going forward. Muslims at this time were not in the rear. They were not at the end, whereas now they are. When Muslims look back and see the glorious time, the glorious age, no wonder they're frustrated. Perhaps you've heard of the book by Bernard Lewis, What Went Wrong. He says that within the last 500 years, Islam has been going downhill. Muslims have not been successful, and they're dysfunctional in many cases. So they're frustrated, and you can't help but wonder what happened to them. Another book written by Riley, his analysis is somewhat simplistic, but he says that the name of the book is The Closing of the Muslim Mind. But it is the same idea that Muslims have had a setback that they've never really recovered from. In this empire, the genius of the Persians was fused with Arabic civilization. They are now oftentimes at odds. The only thing that seems to unite them is one enemy. But with the Persians and Shiite Islam versus the Arabs, for the most part, Sunni Islam, you have a lot of divisions there. So another one was the Fatimids in 901 to 1174. This is Islam in Egypt. And this is Ismaili dynasty, an offshoot of the Shiites. When I think of Ismailis, I think of northern Pakistan, where I've run into quite a few of them. They're the Hunza people up there. They look somewhat oriental, grow a lot of fruit, apricots and things like that. And their head is Aga Khan, whose picture is all over the place. Aga Khan is more or less, he is almost worshipped by them, but he protects them and provides for them and fights for them, certainly as a powerful person. The Fatimid dynasty is another one. These folks call themselves caliphs. And just laying hold of that term, that use of that term, caliph, is an attempt to to have legitimacy. And so anytime you use that term, you're sort of dipping back into the past and the caliphate that existed way back there. The Fatimids take their name from Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. Remember that he didn't have any sons, but he did have daughters, and the most famous one is Fatima. The Ismailis today, as I think I mentioned a minute ago, were persecuted, and they were basically run out of areas where they were in the beginning. They've gone to India, Pakistan. I've also seen quite a few Ismailis in Karachi, Pakistan, and I've already mentioned in northern Pakistan, but you see them in Calgary as well. I've met quite a few Ismaili Muslims, not quite a few, but there are Ismaili Muslims there. They are wealthy, but they are a branch of Shiite Islam. Another group is the Buyids, 932 to 1062, also called Buwayyids, controlled Persia and Iraq. Then you had the Seljuks, or the Seljuks, from 1169 to 1260. These were also known as Ayyubids, Turks, and their leader was Saladin. He was called Saladin in Europe, and he was the great heroic figure in the Crusades. He was a Kurd, and he directed war against the Crusaders, and in fact, he defeated them and retook Jerusalem. If you ever get a chance, look at the story of how St. Francis of Assisi witnessed to him right in the middle of a crusade. Went on the battlefield, went and asked to meet Saladin, and boldly went there and said he had a message from God. Saladin didn't kill him, as was expected, but he listened to him and gave him permission to preach in a pretty large area, offered him gifts, and St. Francis said, "No, I've not come to take your gifts, but I've come to preach the gospel, tell you about God, tell you about Christ." Well, to refuse Arab gifts was sort of an affront and an insult. But nevertheless, Saladin listened to him. And he didn't obviously become a believer because he later retook Jerusalem. Nevertheless, it's an amazing story of a good, positive witness in the midst of the Crusades that were so shameful. There were the Mongols from 1258 to 1506. These were from the north. Mongols, they were shamanists, brilliant militarily, but in spite of that brilliance, they were open to other cultures, open to other religions, and in so doing, they more or less lost their own identity. They were influenced by the Buddhists, the Nestorians, and the Turkish elements, and eventually they became submerged in other groups, and they became Muslim. This is an amazing story that happened. And so then you had the Mughals, which really came out of them, a major Islamic empire that was in India, based in India. These were the rulers, Mughal empires, Aurangzeb and others, Shah Jahan. And you could go to India today and see the remnants of this, the Golden Temple and other things, not the Golden Temple, but the Taj Mahal. And in India, the Mughals got along. In other words, they somehow, lived with people in peace. They were not extremists for the most part. Some of them were, but many of them were not. The Mughals in India. Then you had the Mamluks. These were Turks in Egypt. You had the Safavids from 1501 to 1722. They made the 12 Imams, the Shiism, the major state religion. This is in, of course, Persia, which is Iran today. Perhaps most famous of all is the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Turks. This is Islam in Western Turkey. It had conquered Constantinople under Mehmet II, who was an extremely brave and ingenious warrior to the saving the least, and they renamed it Istanbul, having besieged the city for 54 days. The Ottomans said that the last Abbasid caliph had relinquished the title Caliphate to them, and they were the final ones. That's how they started out. They exploited that title to support their imperial claims and to legitimize their reign. And the empire reached its height under Suleiman the Magnificent, who died in 1566. Of course, Europeans attacked this concept ideologically, and eventually Turkey became westernized. Nationalism had stirred, and eventually it was declared a secular state under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1924. And that was no small blow to the Muslims worldwide, because they said, this was our government. This was the way, the Caliphate, in other words, that was Muslim. And so then the whole empire was lost in World War I, and it was carved up. Well, lastly, there were select reform movements, and I wanted to mention just one of them. The 1700s saw the rise of the Wahhabi movement, and 1800s the rise of various other Muslim movements. You see, Islam is growing, and it's growing pan-Islamic, and it's growing anti-Western. These reform movements continued in various parts of the world, with many nation states gaining independence from Western colonialism. And many of them used Islam. In other words, Islam was sort of a unifying principle to more or less stir them up. They used Islam, and Islam became a force to get rid of colonialism. And I think today it's true too, because Islam is what's used to to raise opposition to what they consider the imperialist United States. And when you think back on history, and for instance, just for example, the British in India, they felt that this was their divine right, and they were arrogant. They felt that this was their divine right to rule India. They said the Indians can't rule themselves. They don't have the intelligence. They don't have the ability to do it. Finally, the British were pushed out in disgrace, and they more or less got on their ships and sailed for home. I'm just reading a couple of books that are quite interesting. One of them is The Imperial Agent, and the other is The Last Victory. These were written by a fellow by the name of T.N. Murari, and it's about a fellow by the name of Kim. And these are thick books, lots of interesting cultural stuff in here, historically accurate stuff about India and the British experience there, and the arrogance of some of those British officers, the injustice and so on, and how this fellow Kim was born. He was actually had a British father and an Indian mother, and he was for a while torn between whether he was really Indian or whether he was British. Finally, he decided that he was Indian, and but he was a brilliant fellow. Eventually, he was killed by the British. But it is an amazing story. Very thick books, The Imperial Agent and The Last Victory. Just in closing, let me say again that some of these movements, reform movements, they were, I think, spurred on by colonialism. They were propelled forward because of the colonial activities. Remember that 9/10 of the Muslim world was at one time under colonial powers, and these were considered to be Christian powers, like Holland or France or Germany or Britain, Great Britain. So eventually Muslims pushed them out and became independent. And of course, today Islam is a rallying cry as well. So with that, we end this lecture.